Welcome to another session with MindsYourHealthcast.com. We're on the verge now of creating a new set of programs, and you'll probably notice that we've changed the format. Without going into a lot of details, it became apparent that our program was a lot for one to listen to at one time, probably number one because of too much content to have to try to absorb, and number two because of time factors. So as you will see with this video, we are reducing it back to a 1/2 hour format instead of an hour or hour plus. And hopefully we can bring the salient points to your attention and do it in such a way that it sticks very well, and you'll be able to gain from it. I will say that I designed the one before as actually training in a sense, because I did have a lot of listeners, watchers, who were really in the health field and were interested in learning a lot. So there were aspects that were probably much more technical than what the average person might want to get involved with. So this will be the beginning of a new approach in the sense that we will condense it more and bring fewer points, but at least the most salient ones. Now, you have just viewed, if you've been watching some of the last ones that were put on YouTube, a series of broadcasts I did related to psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, the brain, the function of the brain, the limits of the brain, if any, and some ideas about repair. So what I want to do in this broadcast, and plan to, as much as we have time, is to kind of bring the key points out of all those broadcasts that have the most application for someone in their everyday life. Now, to begin with, unfortunately, we did not come into this world, when we look at equipment, if we go out and buy a piece of equipment, there's always an owner's manual. Either comes with it, or you can go online and get a copy of it and or read it, and gives you not only background information, but kind of step-by-step methods of making use of, or actually operating, in the case of a piece of equipment, operating it properly. So here we come into this system of things with a body and a mind, brain, and we kind of are left to our own devices to figure it all out. Interestingly, several years ago, someone spent the time to create something called the Owner's Manual for the Brain. And the subtitle is Everyday Applications from Mind-Brain Research. Now this, if you got nothing out of this whole session, this would be a good thing to get, because it does give you a lot of information about the brain and the function of the brain, and how to make use of and improve, correct, etc. All the things you really need to know. It's a rather thick book, as you can see, but if that was the only textbook or manual you had for the brain, that's pretty good. It can be put in a book of this size. Now this particular one that I have is, I've got actually both editions. There was an original edition. This is the second edition. And if you are going to purchase it, I would make sure that the second edition is the latest. And if not, get the new one, because the research on the brain is moving at a tremendous rate. Now it's interesting that for many years, medicine taught us that we were kind of stuck with what we got. They said that as we're developing, we increase the number of neurons until we reach a certain point, usually late teen years, and then from then on, it's downhill. We've been taught that you could not grow new neurons. What you ended up with is what you were stuck with, so to speak. And if you damage those, you're in big trouble because you couldn't repair them. And as you age, of course, they keep dying off, and certain things that you might do in your life could damage and destroy and get rid of a lot more neurons, so that by the time you reach a mature age, you probably only have a fraction of the brain that you started with, and therefore you could be excused if you don't remember very well and you can't learn very well, and a lot of things, maybe even lose touch with your surroundings, could happen because you just didn't have enough brain left to do too much. Well, actually the research has proven just the opposite. The fact is that the more you use your brain, like any muscle in your body, the better it can get. And really, the newest research out there says a lot of things that actually are contrary to what was always taught. Now, I remember, and I mentioned this in one of the broadcasts, I was involved in the early biofeedback movement in this country, and biofeedback is a method of giving feedback to your brain so it can learn to change things. Not only behavior, but functions. And the originator, as far as I can see, was a professor at New York University by the name of Dr. Neil Miller. And he got the idea that we could train the body functions via the brain to make change. In other words, if we had a headache, we could train ourselves out of it. If we had poor circulation, we could train ourselves to improve our circulation. If we had bad breathing episodes from asthma, we could train ourselves to relax the bronchioles and counter an asthmatic attack. And anyhow, he decided that he would get some of his graduate students to set up a study to study in rats the effect of retraining so that the rat could control certain body functions. Now, the joke of it was that none of the research students were interested because they had already been taught on the way up by the latest in medical knowledge that you could not train the autonomic nervous system because it's automatic. It's below our conscious level, and it carries out things automatically, and hence we can't do a thing about it except accept what we have. Now, one of my early experiences, and I got involved at that point. I was in Ohio in the formation of the Ohio Biofeedback Society. I attended some of the big conferences, the major one in New York years and years ago, where all the top people from around the world involved with biofeedback came to that conference, and of course the latest in equipment that had become available. Now, biofeedback equipment in essence is a piece of equipment that monitors some physiological response, and as you change that action, then the instrument tells you that you've made a change. In other words, if you're uptight and tense, and your muscles are tight, and tight to the point that they chronically then start to hurt because of the tension, you can attach a piece of equipment called an electromyograph, which means it measures electrical impulses coming to the muscles, and get a baseline of how much tension is there. And then consciously, you can start to train yourself to relax those muscles. And the biofeedback machine tells you that they're starting to relax. The electrical impulses going to the muscles are slowing down or decreasing in intensity. And at some point, you've trained those muscles to become relaxed. Now, a lot of times it was done on the forehead muscles because a lot of people tighten up their forehead under stress and anxiety, many times to the point that they actually have deep furrows in the exterior tissue and skin that develop because of the chronic tensions underneath. They do the same thing around the eyes and around the mouth. And so some of those deep lines that develop around the mouth have to do with chronic tension of holding your mouth. And of course, if you are an observer of people and behavior, you will notice how differently many people speak, whether they speak out of one side of their mouth, whether they don't use the upper lip but speak mostly with the lower lip, whether they kind of let the words fall out of their mouth or they're very dramatic in their articulation. All of those have to do with the tensions going on, and if you continue to do that over time, pretty soon those can become set, so you almost develop a mask. So biofeedback would enable you to actually measure the amount of tension and begin to train yourself to relax it. So at any rate, finally Dr. Miller was able to get the people interested in doing something on the biofeedback side, and found that lo and behold, everything they had been taught by regular medicine ended up being wrong. The fact is, you could retrain the autonomic system, and you could start doing, taking care of a lot of problems and issues. And that's one of the, we found out in Ohio, at the Ohio Biofeedback Society, that people that had an asthmatic problem, if something happened that caused a slight decrease in their breathing, they would become afraid they were going to have an asthmatic attack and not be able to breathe at all. And the fear of the bronchioles closing up and not being able to breathe actually intensified the constriction of the bronchioles until they went into a panic and a full-blown asthmatic attack. So in biofeedback, what they were taught is that when that feeling started to occur, they would induce in their mind a counter idea that the bronchioles would become relaxed. And so what they could do, they could break the asthmatic attack by training their mind. And in many, many cases, it would be so bad before that they would end up in the emergency room in the hospital because they couldn't breathe. And so it was a good way of breaking that whole cycle, and pretty soon they had less and less attacks because they began to know that they could stop it whenever it started. So that was very good information, and that's all under, as I say, biofeedback, which really gets into mind-body medicine. Now, we've talked a good bit about that before, and really don't have time in this short presentation to go into it in detail, but it is tremendously good information, and it's not new. Before, I held up a notebook about this thick, which is 3,000 years history of body-mind medicine that was known over the centuries. But interestingly, it seemingly never caught on in mainstream. And then when modern medicine took over, they got to the point that they would always determine, well, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. They would put it out as a law, and of course right away, if these learned men of medicine said it, then it would be stupid for me to think that I could do otherwise. Now there's actually a large section in this book on the owner's manual for the brain, talking about mind-body relationships. Now, two things. One is I want to mention some of those new things I told you about before that have been found about the mind, brain in recent years. Now, the controversy still stands out there that what is the difference between mind and brain? Now, medicine says that the mind, now this is traditional medicine, they say that the mind is the result of neurological functions going on in the brain. In other words, it's a side effect of the neurology of the brain working, that it kind of creates this thing we think of as the mind as a artifact, really, of neurological function. So then there's others that say, no, there is a mind and there's a brain. And the mind works through the brain. Now, there's some pretty strong evidence for that also, especially when you remove one whole half of the brain and everything reorganizes and you can function on both sides, even though physiologically one half of the brain controls one half of the body. Nonetheless, I've seen, and there are documented cases where removing half of the brain because of an injury that was impairing the function on one side of the body, therefore the person was actually half functioning, and the damage was so bad on that side of the brain that they finally opted, because of massive seizures, to remove that half of the brain, which they did. Now, they anticipated the person would be permanently paralyzed on the side related to the hemisphere that was removed. But lo and behold, as the person recovered, they recovered the function of the other side and were actually able to use it and did not have a permanent total paralysis of the other side. And so it appears there's a lot of good evidence that indicates that the mind exists as a separate entity, even though not very well understood yet. But at the same time, there are certain principles of operation that seem to take place. Now, as far as the physical structure of the brain, more and more has been learned about it. Dr. Amen, out at his big clinic in California, the Amen Clinics, A-M-E-N, he has done a lot in studying the structure and function of the brain by means of a special imaging unit called a SPECT, S-P-E-C-T, and he uses that, or at least he has in time past, unless he's changed recently. He has used that to make an image of the brain. It's actually like a 3-camera CAT scanner, and it brings up on the computer this 3-dimensional image of the brain, which can be rotated all around 360 degrees or inverted and turned around vertically. So it can be vertically or horizontally rotated. And so what it does, it shows the parts of the brain that are functioning. And when a part of the brain is not functioning, it shows up as an empty spot on the image. Quite interesting material, and he's learned a lot about the brain-mind by utilizing the SPECT imaging. So anyhow, it was interesting to see that a change in brain affected certain functions, and certain functions can affect certain parts of the brain. So I'm sure we're not going to settle the mind-brain controversy, but if you deal with each of those and the principles that have been learned about them, then you can make good use of it. Now, to me, some of the fascinating things about the brain is it's, first of all, has 2 hemispheres. So there's a left-right brain. And many years back, in the early years of biofeedback, there was a lot of studies indicating that each of the halves of the brain kind of specialized in certain types of functions, and that some people tended to be more right brain or left brain. And of course, we don't have time to get into all the details, but if you want to get some good information from way back when all the original work was done, there's a very good book out called The Psychology of Consciousness by Dr. Robert Ornstein. He was a big researcher at the Porter Langley Neuropsychiatric Institute in California, and they did a lot of those big early studies, and over the years he's written a number of extremely good books about the brain and the mind and problems and capabilities. One of the books he wrote was called The Amazing Brain, and he wrote one called The Roots of the Self, which was kind of understanding how people are born with different capabilities and sensitivities of the brain and the way it functions. And so The Roots of the Self is a really good one to understand why one person, information coming in through the senses is overwhelming. In other words, their system is so sensitive, their brain sensory system is so sensitive that actually things can hurt. Now there's some, like if the sound is very loud, in some cases to you it wouldn't be loud at all, but another person it would be painfully overwhelming. And there are some studies, again, we don't have time to get into, in relation to autism and the sensitivity of the hearing especially, but also vision. Some people can't stand too bright lights or too much intense visual stimulation. Some the same thing with their touch. So the fact is that all of those are indicative of the uniqueness of each person. And into one person who is highly sensitive to sounds, they prefer a quiet environment. They prefer to be away from all the noise and the bright lights and the confusion and all the things going on. They would prefer to be off, away from all of that. Otherwise it becomes too overwhelming. On the other hand, people who are born with duller senses, meaning that it's almost like hardly anything is coming into their brain mind, then those people seek things that make a lot of noise and that there's a lot of bright flashing lights. And it's like they like Broadway, the big city, or the Strip in Las Vegas, with all the noise and all the lights and all the color and all this stuff going on. And even physically, they prefer doing things where there's a lot of sensory stimulation going on because they need that. Otherwise, they feel like something is missing. So here you've got two extreme opposites and everything in between that. So there's a lot of uniqueness in each brain-mind system. Now, a lot of this will be good information for you in this book. But if you're particularly interested in the brain-mind functions and what makes them unique and what problems are related, the book, as I said, by Dr. Ornstein, called The Roots of the Self, tells you about 3 different aspects of the brain that can be different, that make a big difference in the way people are and the way they deal with reality and what they can't stand. Now, it doesn't mean you're stuck with that, because there's ways you can change that, biofeedback being one. And, of course, the other aspect that's really important is the nutrition, because now, as we're talking about the physical side, the brain requires certain minerals and certain amino acids to build neurotransmitters and to rebuild itself. And so there's a tremendous amount known now about what good nutrients are necessary, actually, for the brain to function right. And so if you're missing those, some very dramatic, bizarre things can happen. Now, we're not going to go into details, but there is a test that there's certain people that have a genetic coding that causes them, when they break down red blood cells, not to be able to dispose of the byproducts, and they become toxic in the system, in the sense that they grab up all the zinc and they grab up all the B6, and the brain can't function well without either of those, and so they develop a lot of neurological problems. There is a test for that, and it's called pyluria, and you then, by supplementing, can improve those functions. Now, the other thing that is brand new is I have a whole book on it. It's called The Other Brain. It's the study of the glial cells in the brain, which for years were thought to be nothing more than filler cells and supportive cells. Now it's been found that and interestingly, that's the major portion of the brain. They've been finding out that they actually do generate neurotransmitters, and they do carry information and support in a lot of things in the brain, and so they're just not taking up space. I think that's the other thing that's always been interesting to me about medicine is, when I was young, they used to talk about useless appendages in our body. We have these things that have no function anymore, and so you can cut them out. It doesn't make any difference. We don't need them. Well, if you wanted to cut out the glial cells out of the brain, you'd probably cut out at least 2/3 or more of the brain, and you wouldn't need such a big cranial vault, and then you might become like the people that sometimes are referred to in one of the popular news analyst programs as pinheads, because if you only needed about 25 or 30% of the space for the neurons, then and didn't have all the glial cells, then you would not need all that cranial space. And as happens, if we don't use things, they tend to change, and over time can actually alter our physical structure. So, the glial cells, knowledge of that is very important. And it's something that somewhere down the road, if it really interests you about the brain, you might want to look into. Then one of the other big interesting things that was found was the mirror neurons. Those are neurons in the brain that first they found in monkeys, because I'm sure you've heard the old expression, monkey see, monkey do. Well, actually what they found out is that they had special neurons called mirror neurons that when they watched another monkey doing something, they would start to repeat the behavior. It's almost as though they learned it just by watching, and pretty soon they were doing it. And so then they said, well, gee, I wonder if humans have those. And so sure enough, they found that humans have mirror neurons also. So when we watch somebody doing something, our brain becomes activated and goes through the same processes that it's going through in the person who's committing this thing. Now, it might seem trivial, but in terms of rehabilitation, it's now been discovered people who have had strokes or severe brain injury and of some sort, and they're working to rehabilitate them and retrain them, that if they watch videos of people doing correctly what they're being trained to do, that they cut down the rehabilitation time tremendously. Now that's still very little known and probably not applied very much yet, but very important information that they made that discovery. We also, as I say, have learned that there's something called neurogenesis. You can grow new neurons, and involved in that is also neural networks, and that's extremely important. Also brain plasticity, which means the brain can reorganize and change what parts it's using to do things. And of course they kind of knew that a long time ago, but in a sense it didn't ring a bell. That if you are doing something that requires very, very, very acute motor skills of the hands and fingers, that the portion of the brain that connects with and activates that part of your anatomy increases in size. In other words, it takes up bigger space in the brain because of the plasticity factor. So getting back to retraining the brain, you can do that. And of course, one of the brand new things now is epigenetics, which says that we inherit certain things from our ancestry that affect us and affect even the way our genes express or don't express, called epigenetics. And what it does, it includes not only physical functions, but it includes behavior. So that's very important. So now we didn't have time to get into this in real depth, but I wanted to make you aware of some of the things that are going on, how you can train to improve things in your body. And a lot of tremendous things in terms of neurofeedback, in not only developing the brain, but in rehabilitation. One lady who has unfortunately recently died, but her work is being carried on, Charlotte Ayers, developed a special type of electroencephalograph that gives instant feedback time so that you can make changes and you know immediately that the brain is changing because of the feedback, getting back to the biofeedback. And so she has brought people out of comas, helped rehabilitate people from bad strokes and bad injuries, and tremendously good. And I had a bunch of articles here on brain injury and neurofeedback, self-healing from the brain, neurofeedback to improve physical balance, incontinence and swallowing, the EEG neurofeedback in combination with clinical psychotherapy for the treatment of psychological disorders, neurofeedback for cerebral palsy. I mean, there's just a pile of things that the information is out there, but yet in everyday practice, you don't find it being utilized. It seems that knowledge appears from insight, creativity, research, probably 20 years and sometimes 30 years before it ever gets out into everyday use. It's almost like modern medicine is a big dinosaur that's kind of lumbering along, and it's really hard to turn its direction at all. It just, once it gets started moving, there's so much weight behind it that it's hard to turn it one way or the other by new information. And so they keep doing the same old things over and over, even though they don't work, and they don't make use of all the new information. Now, it appears to me that we are coming down to the end of our line again. So I hope maybe you like this new format. Shorter time, and if your time is limited, then you can squeeze it in. And so we're going to be bringing a lot of subjects now in a shorter format, and even some talk of maybe putting up more than one a week. In other words, maybe a couple in a week. I don't know. We'll see how that works out. It was nice to be with you. We want you to be sure and go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and you can actually click a link from there to the Office Alternative Therapy website. We have that, and we have a lot of informational pages on Mind Your Healthcast about some of the things we've talked about, and one of the latest is in one of our broadcasts on healthy sugars that are necessary for the body to function. There's a page on that, and I'll remind you again of whole body vibration. There's a good page on that, how important that is. And now I'm just tapping into some other stuff that we'll probably be doing in one of our broadcasts. To me, it's so exciting. There's so much out there. There's so many things happening, and good. There's a lot of good things. You're rarely ever going to hear it on the news because they tend to focus on crises of various sorts. But we want to bring you the good news of the good things that are happening that you can improve your health. It was nice to be with you again. We look forward to seeing you in our next broadcast.